Have you ever wondered how such a dehumanizing practice like slavery could have been justified? Throughout history, slavery has emerged as a deeply complex and controversial issue, and understanding the arguments made for and against it is crucial. Today, we're embarking on a journey to explore the top 10 arguments that were presented during the time when slavery was a widespread practice. We'll be examining both sides of the coin, delving into the reasons used to both defend and denounce this institution. From the economic necessity it was claimed to fulfill, to the moral and religious opposition that stood against it, we'll be unpacking these arguments in a countdown format. Understanding these perspectives is vital, not only for a comprehensive grasp of history, but also for recognizing the echoes of these arguments in modern discourse. So, let's dive into this countdown of the top 10 arguments for and against slavery. Starting at number 10, the argument of economic necessity. Some proponents of slavery asserted it as an economic backbone, offering inexpensive labor for large plantations in various industries. They claimed that without this labor force, economies, particularly in the South, would crumble. The workforce, they argued, enabled the production of commodities such as cotton and tobacco at a scale and cost that would be impossible otherwise. This argument, while deeply flawed, was widely used to justify the continuation of slavery. On the other side, the 10th argument against slavery was human rights. Abolitionists vehemently argued that slavery was a gross violation of the basic rights that every human should inherently possess. Economic gain, they asserted, could never justify stripping individuals of their dignity and freedom. They fervently championed the principle that each person, regardless of their origin or race, deserved respect and liberty. These passionate voices refused to be silenced, relentlessly pushing against the tide of societal norms. This argument laid the groundwork for the abolitionist movement. Our 9th argument for slavery was social order. Proponents of slavery argued that it maintained a clear hierarchy, keeping society in balance. They claimed that without slavery, this balance would be disrupted, leading to chaos and disorder. This was a society structured like a pyramid, with the enslaved at the bottom and the slave owners at the top. This argument was often used to instill fear of societal collapse without slavery. The 9th argument against slavery was moral and religious opposition. Abolitionists fervently wielded moral and religious convictions as potent weapons against the institution of slavery. They argued that slavery was fundamentally wrong, a gross violation of human dignity and decency, and diametrically opposed to religious teachings that advocated for love, compassion, and equality. This moral and religious opposition resonated deeply, stirring the conscience of many. This argument appealed to the moral conscience of people and fueled the abolitionist movement. Now let's go through arguments 8 to 5 for and against slavery. At number 8, we find the argument of racial superiority. This was a notion propagated by many pro-slavery advocates, suggesting that certain races were naturally superior to others, and thus it was their duty to rule over and guide the inferior races. This argument, however, was vehemently opposed by anti-slavery activists, who insisted on the equal worth and dignity of all human beings, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Then, moving to argument number 7, we encounter the legal justifications for slavery. Proponents of slavery often pointed to laws and regulations, both national and international, that recognized and sanctioned the institution of slavery. Yet, this argument was countered by those who argued that just because something is legal does not necessarily make it morally right. They urged for a re-evaluation of laws that permitted such a dehumanizing practice. Coming to argument number 6, we see the notion of civilizing savages. This argument was rooted in the belief that bringing individuals from uncivilized societies into slavery was a form of benevolent action, as it introduced them to civilized ways of life. Anti-slavery activists, however, decried this argument as patronizing and exploitative, stating that no one has the right to impose their way of life on others, especially not through coercion. Finally, at number 5, we have the argument of slavery as a necessary evil. This argument posited that slavery, while morally reprehensible, was an economic necessity that societies could not do without. Again, this argument was contested by those who believed that no economic benefit could justify the degradation and exploitation of fellow human beings. These arguments reflect the complex and contentious debates that surrounded slavery. Moving on to arguments 4 to 2 for and against slavery. The 4th argument supporting slavery was the claim that slaves were property. Advocates of slavery argued that slaves were akin to any other piece of property like a horse or a piece of furniture, and that any attempt to free them was akin to theft. This argument, however, was met with strong opposition from abolitionists who asserted that humans could never be reduced to mere property. They argued that every person has innate rights that cannot be bought, sold, or owned. The third argument in favor of slavery was the belief in African inferiority. Proponents of slavery contended that Africans were naturally inferior, and therefore fit for servitude. This argument was used to justify the harsh treatment and subjugation of enslaved Africans. In contrast, abolitionists challenged this belief, asserting that all men are created equal. They argued that the perceived inferiority of Africans was the result of their enslavement and not their natural condition. The second argument supporting slavery was the defense of it as a long-standing tradition. Supporters of slavery pointed to its existence in ancient civilizations and throughout history as a justification for its continuation. They argued that slavery was an established part of society and economy, and that its abolition would disrupt the social order. On the flip side, abolitionists argued that just because something is a long-standing tradition doesn't make it morally right. They emphasized that society evolves and that traditions that infringe upon human rights should be abandoned. These arguments further illustrate the deeply ingrained beliefs that propped up the institution of slavery. The claim of slaves as property, the belief in African inferiority, and the defense of slavery as a tradition were all entrenched viewpoints that fueled the perpetuation of slavery. But as we've seen, each of these arguments was met with staunch opposition from those who believed in the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings. Finally, the number one argument for slavery was the Bible's endorsement. Some proponents of slavery turned to religious texts, twisting the words to fit their narrative. They pointed to passages in the Old and New Testaments, arguing that the Bible seemingly endorsed the institution of slavery. However, this interpretation was far from unanimous and was hotly contested. This argument was perhaps the most controversial, as it twisted religious teachings to support a cruel and inhumane practice. The number one argument against slavery was the equality principle. This principle, championed by abolitionists, posits that every individual, irrespective of their race, is equal. In a world where differences in skin color were used to justify inhumane practices, abolitionists defied the norm. They contended that slavery, in its very essence, was fundamentally wrong, as it violated this universal principle of equality. This powerful argument was instrumental in turning the tide against slavery. This countdown has taken us through the key arguments that shaped the debate over slavery. We've journeyed through the economic, social, and religious facets that both supported and opposed this inhumane practice. On one side, we witnessed the argument of economic necessity, the belief that slavery was essential for the prosperity of certain industries. Conversely, we heard the clarion call for human rights, a plea for the inherent dignity and equality of every individual. We delved into the social order argument, the assertion that slavery was a natural part of societal hierarchy. Yet, we also explored the moral and religious opposition, which argued that slavery was fundamentally incompatible with ethical and spiritual values. We examined the biblical endorsement of slavery and the counter-argument rooted in the principle of equality. Each of these arguments, in their own way, reflected the societal attitudes of their time, mirroring the complexities and contradictions of human thought and behavior. Understanding these arguments helps us to better comprehend this dark period in our history and ensure that such injustices never occur again.